When the gold window closed in 1971, the world did not collapse, but it lost its anchor. For nearly 3 decades, gold had quietly disciplined the system. Even when few understood the mechanics, they understood the promise. Dollars could become gold. After August 1971, that promise ended. The dollar remained powerful, but it no longer had metal behind it. The question became immediate and unavoidable. If gold no longer anchored the global system, what would? In the years that followed, the answer did not come from a vault. It came from oil, and from a quiet set of agreements that reshaped global trade without rewriting a single gold law. Before we continue, if you're interested in real stories about gold, power, and the decisions that reshaped the global system without public spectacle, this channel focuses on documented history, not conspiracy. Because sometimes the most important shifts are contractual. The Bretton Woods system had given the dollar structure. Gold provided limits. Convertibility created discipline. Trust was reinforced by metal. When that convertibility ended, the dollar remained dominant, but vulnerable. Foreign governments still held large reserves of dollars. International trade was still priced in dollars, but the final guarantee was gone. If countries lost confidence, they could sell dollars. If too many did so at once, exchange rates could destabilize. The early 1970s were already turbulent. Inflation was rising. The Vietnam War strained budgets. Energy markets were tightening. Without gold as a backstop, the United States needed something else to ensure global demand for dollars. Not ideology, not persuasion, demand. And the most powerful source of demand in the modern world was energy. In 1973, the global system faced a second shock, this time not from gold, but from oil. The Yom Kippur War triggered geopolitical tensions across the Middle East. In response to Western support for Israel, members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States and several other countries. Oil prices surged, supply tightened. Energy, already central to industrial economies, became a pressure point. The crisis exposed something critical. Control over oil meant control over economic stability. Modern economies did not run on gold. They ran on energy. Factories, transportation, electricity, agriculture, all depended on oil. If oil prices rose sharply, inflation followed. If supply was restricted, growth slowed. For the United States, the oil shock was not just an energy problem. It was a monetary problem. Without gold backing the dollar, maintaining global demand required another structural support. Oil, the most traded commodity in the world, offered that support. If oil transactions could be anchored to the dollar, global demand for dollars would become structural, not optional. In 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia entered into a series of agreements that would reshape the monetary system. The arrangement was not framed as a replacement for gold. It was presented as cooperation. Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter within OPEC, agreed to price its oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, the United States provided military support, security guarantees, and access to American financial markets. The structure created a feedback loop. Oil importing countries needed dollars to purchase oil. To obtain dollars, they had to participate in dollar-denominated trade or hold dollar reserves. As oil revenues accumulated, Saudi Arabia and other exporters recycled surplus dollars into US Treasury bonds and American financial assets. The dollar gained a new foundation. Not metal, energy. The agreement did not appear dramatic on television. There was no single announcement declaring a new system, but in practical terms, a new anchor had emerged. Gold had disciplined the dollar through scarcity. Oil disciplined the system through necessity. And necessity, in the modern world, was far more powerful than metal. The mechanism was simple in structure, but profound in consequence. Oil exporting countries agreed to price their oil in US dollars. Importing countries, regardless of their own currency, needed dollars to purchase energy. This created automatic global demand. Even nations with little direct trade relationship to the United States needed dollar reserves to secure oil supplies. Central banks adjusted accordingly. They increased their holdings of US dollars. They accumulated US Treasury securities as reserve assets. They conducted international transactions in dollar-denominated contracts. Meanwhile, oil-exporting nations accumulated large dollar surpluses. Those surpluses did not remain idle. They were invested in American financial markets, particularly government debt. This recycling of petrodollars strengthened US capital markets. It lowered borrowing costs. It deepened liquidity. It reinforced the dollar's central role. The system did not require a formal global treaty. It operated through trade flows and financial reinvestment. Oil demand ensured dollar demand. Dollar demand ensured US financial leverage. The anchor had shifted again. Not to gold, to energy-backed currency circulation. The petrodollar system provided something the post-1971 world urgently needed: structural demand. Under the gold standard, dollar demand existed because dollars could be converted into metal. After 1971, that promise ended. Without replacement, global dollar demand could have weakened. Oil solved that vulnerability. Because oil was essential to industrial economies, and because oil was priced in dollars, every country participating in global trade needed access to the US currency. The arrangement also reinforced geopolitical relationships. Security cooperation strengthened ties between the United States and key oil producers. Financial flows tied energy exporters to US markets. Over time, the dollar's dominance expanded beyond oil. Commodities, global loans, sovereign debt, and international trade increasingly used the dollar as the default settlement currency. The system became self-reinforcing. The more it was used, the harder it was to replace. Gold had once anchored the dollar through scarcity. Oil anchored it through ubiquity. And ubiquity created resilience. The primary beneficiary of the petrodollar system was the United States. By anchoring global energy trade to the dollar, the US ensured sustained international demand for its currency. This demand produced multiple advantages. First, it allowed the United States to finance deficits more easily. Foreign governments and institutions needed dollars and US Treasury securities as reserve assets. That steady demand lowered borrowing costs and supported deep capital markets. Second, it strengthened financial influence. Because global trade cleared largely in dollars, the US financial system became central to international settlement. Clearing networks, correspondent banking, and dollar liquidity mechanisms positioned American institutions at the core of global finance. Third, it reinforced geopolitical leverage. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial policy decisions gained weight because access to the dollar system mattered. Energy importing nations needed dollars. Oil exporters invested in dollar-denominated assets. The network effects accumulated over time. For oil-producing nations aligned with the United States, benefits also emerged. Security guarantees provided stability. Access to American financial markets offered investment channels for surplus revenues. The arrangement was not one-sided. It was mutually reinforcing, but it was structured around one currency, and that currency was no longer tied to gold. For many countries, the petrodollar system created a form of structural dependency. Nations importing energy needed dollar reserves regardless of their domestic monetary policy. If their currencies weakened, they required more local currency to obtain dollars. If dollar liquidity tightened globally, energy costs could spike. Central banks adapted by holding significant dollar reserves. Over time, the dollar became the primary reserve currency worldwide. Even countries with limited trade ties to the United States held dollar assets because others did. The system reinforced itself through scale. Alternatives were possible in theory. Pricing oil in other currencies, diversifying reserves, but replacing an established network proved difficult. The more the dollar was used, the more convenient it became. The more convenient it became, the more it was used. This dynamic created stability, but also concentration. The anchor that replaced gold did not sit in a vault. It flowed through pipelines, contracts, and balance sheets. And once established, such systems do not easily unwind. Over time, the petrodollar system reshaped not just finance, but geopolitics. Currency dominance became a strategic asset because global trade, energy markets, and sovereign reserves were largely denominated in dollars. The United States occupied a unique position within the international system. Access to dollar clearing networks became critical for banks worldwide. Dollar liquidity shortages during crises could destabilize entire regions. U.S. monetary policy decisions influenced global capital flows. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, emerging markets felt the impact. When the dollar strengthened, energy importing countries faced higher costs. Financial leverage became a tool of statecraft. Sanctions targeting access to dollar-based systems gained effectiveness precisely because the network was so central. This power was not built through conquest. It was built through architecture. The architecture that replaced gold did not depend on metal shipments. It depended on settlement systems, reserve accumulation, and commodity pricing. Gold once imposed discipline externally. The dollar system imposed influence internally, and that influence extended beyond economics into diplomacy and security. Despite periodic criticism and calls for alternatives, the petrodollar system endured. Why? Because replacing it required coordination at a scale few nations could achieve. For oil to be priced in another currency, producers and consumers would need to agree simultaneously. Financial markets would need sufficient depth in alternative currencies. Reserve systems would need restructuring. Each step introduced friction. Meanwhile, the existing system functioned. It provided liquidity. It offered established clearing mechanisms. It supported global trade flows. Even countries that questioned dollar dominance continued to hold dollar reserves for practical reasons. Over time, habit reinforced structure. Structure reinforced reliance. The anchor created after 1971 proved resilient not because it was perfect, but because it was integrated. Gold had once anchored the system through scarcity. Oil anchored it through necessity. The dollar anchored it through scale. In 1971, gold stopped anchoring the dollar. In 1974, oil began doing the work gold once performed, not visibly, not ceremonially, but structurally. For decades, the system held. Energy demand ensured dollar demand. Dollar demand ensured reserve accumulation. Reserve accumulation reinforced financial dominance. The arrangement proved durable. But no monetary system is permanent. Gold once appeared unshakable. Convertibility once seemed untouchable, yet both gave way under pressure. Today, conversations about alternatives reappear: digital currencies, regional trade agreements, bilateral settlement in non-dollar terms, diversification of reserves. None of these developments immediately displaced the dollar. But history suggests that anchors shift when structural pressures accumulate. The gold standard ended because the arithmetic no longer worked. The Bretton Woods system collapsed because convertibility exceeded reserves. The petrodollar endured because demand aligned with necessity. The question for the future is not ideological, it is structural. If energy markets evolve, If trade flows fragment, if financial networks decentralize, what replaces the anchor? Gold disciplined through scarcity, oil disciplined through necessity, the dollar disciplined through scale. But scale depends on trust, and trust, once questioned, demands reinforcement. The decision that made the dollar the world's anchor did not eliminate gold. It replaced it. And the final question is this: if the anchor shifts again, what holds the system steady?